Today we're going to be talking about the history of the race idea and how anthropologists and biologists and geneticists, as we've talked about earlier in this course, they know that race in the human species is an incorrect way to talk about our differences. Race is something that is based in biology. And in order to be classified into races, we actually need a certain amount of DNA that's different from one another. Any two individuals on the planet should have, in order to be classified into races or subspecies or variants, they should have about 0.25 differences. It's called fixation. But in fact, the most that any two individuals have is 0.14 FST. Which means that humans are so similar across the globe that we cannot divide ourselves into biological races. Let's talk a little bit more about this, though. So what do we mean by race, right? When we talk about race, there's all kinds of ideas that come up. People talk about race as color, talk about race as biological differences. We also talk about race as social and economic differences. So while, of course, racism is real and people's lived experience should be validated, socially, race and prejudice and discrimination based on race is real. Biologically, we do not have enough difference in the human species to divide ourselves into races. So race is more of a social idea than a biological one for humans. If we go all the way back to Linnaeus in 1758, he added 5 varieties of Homo sapiens to his great classification scheme, his taxonomy. And he did this based on the stories of explorers and people who were coming back from the Americas and Africa and Asia and all of these places where Europeans were exploring. And so based on these wild and exotic stories of all these different people who, of course, they didn't understand at all, they couldn't speak their language, and they looked down upon them as subhuman, right? He added 5 varieties. And these 5 varieties, got codified into this book, right, called Systema Naturae, which we've talked about, I think, earlier on in the course. So Linnaeus added the feral variety of Homo sapiens, which is sort of the wild, 4-foot, hairy, and mute Homo sapien, which I think probably was an orangutan or another ape. Homo sapiens americanus, which he wrote down in his book as red people. I don't know where this comes from. He gave everybody a color term, which surprisingly we still use 300 years later. And when I found out that these color terms went back to 1758, I was just horrified that we haven't gotten rid of them already. Right? Today, of course, we think of them more as misguided and often used in insulting ways to categorize and classify people unfairly. Because no one's skin is actually red. If you look at a Pantone color wheel, no one's skin is actually white or yellow or black. He also gave them all kinds of characteristics, again, based on these stories. All of it was really unfair, non-scientific, and subjective. The Homo sapiens europaeus of all of these were, of course, classified as the most sort of, as the smartest, the ones who were the best looking, with the flowing hair, and they were very inventive and curious, and they were ruled by custom and law. The Asiaticus, yellow, classified, and Afer is another word for black, right? So these black, red, yellow, and white terms come all the way down to us from these unscientific stories that were told to Linnaeus, who then put them in his text. So by the mid-19th century, this really hierarchical view of races based primarily on skin color were really well established. That is to say, People thought these were God-given traits, and if you had a skin color that was other than the European ideal of having, light skin, then, and not everybody had, the white skin, because even if you had light skin but you were from Asia, you were classified differently, classified as yellow in a very arbitrary way. So if you didn't have the white skin, as the Europeans did, and even among Europeans, there were lighter people and the darker people, like the Greeks and the Italians, were seen as lesser than the British and the French and the Nordic people, for instance. But this got really well established, and so people at the time believed it was something that was innate and linked to personality or intelligence or characteristics. We now know that this is totally bunk. Eugenics came out of this, and eugenics is a sort of philosophy of race improvement. There are many forms of eugenics. One that we know tragically and very well was the eugenics science that was used by the Nazis in World War II to help to try to exterminate different parts of the German society. Some of those groups were Jewish people, gypsies, and other people that were not to the perfect Aryan ideal that Hitler desired. Sterilization practices persist even into the 20th and 21st century, where people will be sterilized against their will or in exchange for something. For instance, prisoners have routinely been sterilized, and this, is meant to limit their reproductive quality or reproductive capacity. Of course it does, right? If you're sterilizing someone, they can't pass on their genes. This is, sort of a form of pseudoscience to say that, we'd like our race to be stronger, therefore we're going to limit the amount of children that some people can have. Of course, this is completely unethical and against the law in most places, and arbitrary. So these are some of the eugenics programs persisting into the 20th and even 21st century. So, you can think about the kinds of things that you've heard about in the United States, even in Canada, or Mexico or other places that you know well, where they still do have eugenics programs under the name of sort of pseudoscience. These are interesting campaigns. So the one on the left says that China has a one-child policy campaign. The one-child policy has recently been eliminated in China, recently in the past few years. So people can have multiple children. But this particular campaign is using a girl, which is interesting because Chinese culture values boys because of family and marriage structures. And they are trying to make having one child seem, like something ideal. And then the one on the right is from India. This one says, big family, problems on the way, small family, happiness all the way. Again, trying to limit their population so that, people can be, people can aspire to be sort of happier and have more resources for the family that they have. So while these aren't, promoting eugenics ideas per se, they are promoting smaller families, which, is a sort of a form of population control. Since race isn't really a thing, right? It's not a real thing biologically. There's lots of ways that people think about race, right? Some people might think about race in terms of nationalities. Languages, ethnicities, or religions, or they might use color terms, right? So if you ask somebody, you might try this, ask somebody, how many races are there and what are they? People will often start listing nationalities or ethnicities, and then once you start doing that, it's hard to stop. Really the only true answer for the word race, which is a biological word, is the human race, because race is equal to species. So race is a cultural concept, not a biological one, for 3 reasons. First, there's not enough biological variation to divide the human species into races, right? Humans share 99.9% of their DNA, and we would need to share less than that in order to be able to divide into races, like I've mentioned. Number 2, race is a cultural concept because we have mostly continuous traits, not discontinuous ones. So continuous traits would be things that you could put people on a spectrum, like skin color, right? Light to dark, face shape, oval to round, height, flatness of face, how far your brow ridges come out, how barrel-chested you are, right? So there's all these things that we could put people on a spectrum in a continuous form, and there's no real categorizations. There's no one start or finish, right? To say like, oh, well, you're a white person and you're not a red person, or you're not a brown person. So, here's where the line starts or stops. Really, we need all kinds of other information in order to make any kind of decisions or judgments about, what ethnicity someone is. I mean, the best way to do it is just to ask them. But we need information that's cultural, right? So if I say, I'm a white person, what language do I speak? Where do my people come from? What do I eat? What do I wear, right? All of that is cultural information. So that's really ethnicity, not race. What got cut off here at the bottom, and if I change it, there's going to be all kinds of crazy video chaos, but what got cut off was discontinuous, an example of discontinuous traits, and that would be ABO blood type, right? So we know we have one singular blood type, whether it's A or AB or O or B. And we also have positives and negatives, right? So if you know your blood type, that's something that is discontinuous, right? That's a discrete trait that could put you into a category that's different from others. But in order for race to be real, all of the things that make someone part of a group would need to be the same with all the other people in that same group. So I would have to have the same blood type and hair type and face shape and lactose tolerance and all these things that were the same as every other person in the white group, which of course I don't, because people who self-identify as white live all over the world. So really what we're talking about is, there's people with a lot of individual differences in terms of our biology. Yeah. So when we think about the things that make us different, usually these are things that have to do more with society and culture. All right, so third, there is more genetic variation within individuals of one so-called group, right? So like a self-identified group, such as whites, than between groups. So there are very few things genetically that are different between a group that self-identifies as white and a group that self-identifies as black, or a group that self-identifies as brown or yellow, or these terrible color terms. We could say Asian or Latino or French or Japanese, right? However people want to self-identify, Maya. So for instance, an African and a European may differ in skin color, but share a whole bunch of other things. Right? And those few genes that are different, they really have to do with gene flow, right? Ancestral gene flow. And that's what it is. So it says at the bottom here, the vast majority of genetic differences are individual and not by group. We're not going to spend a lot of time on demography in our class, but I think that, in going through these slides, this one you'll have to look at the other slide to see the full graph. I'm sorry about the small size of this video, but you can think about how the composition of a population really has long-term and far-reaching effects for things like mortality, things like lifespan, and all of the other demographic information. that makes a population a population. And I'll end here, and hopefully you'll be able to go through these slides on your own.